Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Journeyman Podcast. So this deep dive, this is episode 24, and we're going to be really looking into something that I think is important to all of us, and that is honest journalism. And we'll be kind of exploring some, just some interesting ideas and examples, and maybe this will kind of shift how you see the news, right? If you're ready for that, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button, and also the link to the source material is down in the description below.
Yeah, it's interesting because, what we're talking about today kind of goes beyond the usual, is it left or is it right, kind of media bias, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Our source actually digs a little deeper, and the link to the source is below. But it kind of looks at something more systemic, that affects how we all interpret the news.
Yeah, for sure. And, we're going to be looking specifically at an interview from the Jimmy Dore show where Jen Psaki, she was a White House press secretary and now she's an MSNBC. Well, she says that she has complete editorial independence. And Jimmy Dore, he's skeptical. He thinks there might be more to the story.
Yeah, it definitely raises questions, I mean, just think about it. What if these big media outlets are actually shaping the narrative to kind of bolster the establishment narrative? And if they are, how are they doing it? Well, our source actually points to a theory called manufacturing consent, which was first brought up by Walter Lippmann all the way back in 1922.
Okay. Manufacturing consent. You got my attention. Tell me more.
So Lippmann and later on Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman, they all argued that media outlets are often influenced by, who owns them, right? Who's giving them their money? And even a filtering system that actually starts way back in our education. They can actually subtly, shape how the public thinks about things, to align with powerful interests.
Okay. So you're saying it's not just biased reporting, but an entire system to promote certain viewpoints? I mean, that's kind of scary, right?
Yeah, it has some serious implications, for how we consume information. Our source actually uses a bunch of different examples to try to, illustrate this point. And he really focuses on MSNBC. One of the examples he talks about is the alleged suspension of 3 Muslim MSNBC anchors right after that Hamas attack on Israel.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's almost like even outlets that are seen as progressive can actually end up silencing voices that challenge those narratives, the established narratives. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. What's interesting here is that, this might not be just one thing, right? It might be a pattern. The source points out that Phil Donahue was fired from MSNBC because he was platforming people who were against the Iraq War. And get this, his show was the highest rated on MSNBC at the time.
Wait a minute. So they fired the guy who had the most viewers because of his stance on the war. If ratings are everything, why would they do that?
Right. And that's a major point that our source is making. There's got to be something else at play here besides ratings. He also mentions Jesse Ventura. His MSNBC show was actually canceled before it even aired because he was against the Iraq War. And then there's Ashley Banfield, who was allegedly removed for, questioning the network's coverage of the Iraq War. So this all seems like, there's a trend here. We should probably look into it.
Yeah. I mean, it makes you think, right, about the bigger picture. So it seems like from all of this that the source is saying, hey, there's this pattern of silencing people who disagree, especially those who are critical of U.S. foreign policy. Is that right?
Yeah, you got it. And this is where this filtering system idea from Chomsky comes in. The source mentions Chomsky, and he's suggesting that this system, it actually starts as early as kindergarten.
Right.
Rewarding those who, follow the rules and kind of reading out the ones who question authority. It's something to think about.
So they're saying that even journalists, their worldviews are being shaped by this system, way before they ever get to a newsroom. I mean, wow, that's kind of wild.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, right, about, true diversity of thought in mainstream media. If everybody's been, conditioned to think a certain way, maybe it explains some of the stuff we're seeing. And this leads us to an interesting question. If we are seeing these potential problems in the mainstream media, are there any alternatives out there?
Well, our source briefly mentions this platform called Rumble. And he kind of highlights how it focuses on free speech and supporting all kinds of different voices.
Oh, yeah. Rumble, I've heard of it, but haven't really looked into it. What makes them different?
Well, they kind of see themselves as the opposite of that censorship and bias that we were talking about that's allegedly in the mainstream media. They offer an ad-free experience for their premium users. And they argue that this lets them operate independently, without any pressure from advertisers.
So they're saying they're not beholden to those same corporate interests that might influence other outlets. Huh. Interesting. Exactly. And they even point out specific times where, mainstream advertisers supposedly tried to pull funding from Rumble because of the content they were putting out there.
Wow. That's pretty wild. It sounds like they're willing to stick to their guns, even if it means, losing money.
Yeah, that's definitely the message they're trying to send. I mean, whether or not Rumble actually lives up to all of that, being this bastion of free speech, that's a whole other question that we'd have to, really look into.
Yeah, you're right. We should always be critical, of all media, regardless of where it comes from. But I am curious, what does our source think about Rumble? Does he see it as a legitimate alternative?
Well, he doesn't fully endorse it or anything, but he does have a Rumble ad in his show, and he tells his viewers to go check it out.
That's interesting. So it sounds like at least he's open to the idea of alternative platforms, This whole discussion has me thinking about, the bigger picture here. Like, what does it mean for journalism? If people are starting to lose trust in those mainstream sources, it just seems like such a big question.
Yeah, it is a critical question, and I think it's something that, these media organizations really need to think about seriously. I mean, if they keep being seen as, just mouthpieces for the establishment, people are going to naturally start looking for their information somewhere else.
It's like that saying, nature abhors a vacuum. If there's like a gap in like reliable, unbiased reporting, something's going to fill that space. And that something might not be accurate, or trustworthy.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be, really discerning media consumers, right? We need to be questioning the narratives that are being presented to us and, actively look for different viewpoints.
This deep dive has really given me a lot to think about. It really reminds me that we can't just sit back and consume information passively. We need to be active participants, critically evaluating everything we see and hear.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to, this manufacturing consent idea, If we're aware of the ways that our perceptions can be, kind of subtly influenced, then we're better equipped to, fight back against that manipulation and form our own opinions, based on, facts and stuff.
So what can people, what can our listeners do to become more discerning consumers of news? Are there some practical steps they can take?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's really important to be aware of your own biases. Ask yourself, what are my preconceived notions about certain topics or people? Where do I get my news from and why?
Yeah, that's great advice. It's so easy to just get stuck in those echo chambers, where you're only surrounded by information that already confirms your existing beliefs.
Yeah.
We need to be more intentional about, breaking out of those patterns.
Exactly. You got to challenge yourself to seek out different viewpoints, even those that make you uncomfortable. Read articles from a variety of publications, listen to podcasts with different perspectives, and engage in, respectful dialogue with people who hold different views.
It's all about stepping outside of your comfort zone and being open to new information, even if it challenges what you thought you knew.
Right. And don't be afraid to question everything you know. Who benefits from this narrative? What are the motives behind it? Are there other explanations that are being ignored?
Those are great questions. It's about, taking control of how we get our information and not just, accepting everything at face value.
And finally, I would say be careful of, all that sensationalism and clickbait stuff. If a headline sounds too crazy to be true, it probably is. Stick to reliable sources that prioritize accuracy and fact-checking.
That's such a good point. Especially these days. It's so easy to get caught up in all the drama and emotion of the news, but we really need to take a step back and look at the facts.
Ultimately, this whole deep dive has been about encouraging critical thinking and media literacy. In a world where we're bombarded with information, constantly, these skills are more important than ever.
Welcome back to the last part of our, look into journalism and media bias and really, trying to find the truth, in this crazy world of information overload. We talked about a lot, right, from that manufacturing consent to those alternative platforms like Rumble. So let's kind of bring it all together and see what we've learned.
Yeah, what really hits home for me from everything we've talked about is how important individual responsibility is. In a time when, information's everywhere, but it's so easy to manipulate, it's like it's on each of us to learn to think critically and be smart about, what media we consume.
Yeah, you're right. It's like we all have to become detectives, right? Like sifting through the evidence and trying to piece together what's really going on. It's tough, but, it's so important these days.
Absolutely. We can't just, sit there and absorb information anymore. We got to be asking questions, about the sources, about the motives and the stories that they're telling us.
So if you had to pick one key takeaway from this whole deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
what would it be? Like, what's the one message you really hope people remember?
If I had to boil it all down to one thing, it would be this, become media literate.
Hmm.
Learn about the ways that they try to, shape public opinion, understand the influence of these big corporations, and realize how important it is to find different perspectives.
It's about empowering ourselves, right? To see through all the BS and get closer to the truth, even if that truth is, uncomfortable or challenging to accept sometimes.
Exactly. And that pursuit of truth, even when it's hard, is so important for a healthy democracy.
This whole conversation has kind of been a wake-up call for me, to be honest. It's easy to just, get comfortable and trust the sources you're used to, but this really shows, how important it is to be a little more skeptical and curious,
Yeah. And that curiosity is what leads to real understanding. Don't be afraid to ask questions, challenge those assumptions, and, really dig into the issues that you care about.
Yeah, like we said before, we're all detectives now.
Yeah.
And that search for truth, well, it's a journey, not a destination.
Well said. And remember, this journey isn't just about taking in information. It's about engaging with it, talking about it with other people, and, using it to form your own, well-informed opinions.
So to wrap things up, I want to leave everyone with a final thought,
Yeah.
from our source material. The next time you see a news story, ask yourself, whose voice is being amplified? Whose voice is missing? And what do those missing voices tell me about, who's controlling the narrative?
Those are great questions to think about. It's about recognizing that there's always more than one side to every story, and that finding those other perspectives is crucial for, getting the full picture.
This has been a really interesting deep dive, and sometimes even a little unsettling, when you look at how the media works. But, I think ultimately it's a hopeful message. By being aware of the ways, they can try to manipulate us, we can become more critical and informed and engaged citizens.
And that's a powerful thing, because when we, the people, are informed and engaged, then we can hold the powerful accountable, and try to create a society that's more just and equitable.
That's a great point to end on. I want to thank everyone for joining us on this journey into, journalism and media. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more of these thought-provoking conversations, hit that like and subscribe button. And as always, remember to stay curious, stay critical, and, keep searching for the truth.